Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the Festival Director. FODI is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival based in Sydney, Australia, that aims to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. FODI gathers the world's best experts, innovative thinkers and mischief makers to provoke and inspire curious minds. Humanity has demonstrated time and time again a horrific tendency to destroy its own kind. This is often to eliminate difference and impose a uniform identity. At its worst, this tendency has led to the crime of genocide. However, in our politically charged climate, the term genocide carries a massive moral weight, and we must be cautious about where to apply it. If we're too restrictive, it will make us blind to evil in the world, but if we're too loose, it will desensitise us to its significance. Join philosophers Stan Grant and Simon Longstaff in the 2024 session Anatomy of Evil, as they explore what genocide is and respond to its presence in the world.
Morning, everybody. Just like to introduce myself. I'm Simon Longstaff, Executive Director of the Ethics Centre, and I'd like to begin with Dan. I think Stan would join me in acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation whose land we're meeting on. For tens of thousands of years, they have been stewards of the things seen and unseen, of the land, the sea and the air, something which they have preserved generously for all who live on these lands to participate in, all who eat of the country, drink of its waters, are welcome. And I'd just personally like to acknowledge their elders, past and present, who are here surrounding us, for the care they've taken of country. And I hope that one day every Australian embraces what they've saved for us all.
And could I just say something from my people as well? Badu Waradri Gibia, Tiromadilanya Badu Waradri, Nadu Yindyamarra, Gadigal Mine, Nadu Yindyamarra Eora Nurambang.
Thank you. So Stan and I are here to talk about probably one of the most politically charged and difficult conversations, and there are so many layers to this. It's about genocide, but it's also about the anatomy of evil, of which genocide has been held in recent times to be perhaps the apotheosis. Stan, we talk about history's cases of genocide. There's been the infamous examples that took place in the 20th century, but they range from what happened to the Jewish people in Europe with the Holocaust and Shoah. There's been the Armenians. There's what happened later on with the Hutus and the Tutsis. And there are probably cases which I don't know of from that earlier period of time. But today the word is again being used in contemporary discussion about events surrounding what's occurring in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, the fate of the people, Palestinian people living in Gaza. I want to start off with the formal definition of genocide, which is in the Convention. And I'm just interested to know, I'll just read through it, what you think of it, whether you think it's a helpful thing or not, and how it contributes to our discussion. And then what we'll do is move from that down to what are the underlying concerns about this issue, about the anatomy of evil. So the current definition of genocide is set out in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. I've taken this off the UN website. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the groups, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So when I look at it, there's a couple of different elements. There's the specific things you can do, but it's this element of intent to destroy in whole or in part. Is that a useful place to start? Is it helpful still in the current conversation about what we're seeing in the world?
I'm sorry that I got my back to some of you too. I feel really terribly rude and exposed here, so please forgive me. But it's, Simon, these things emerge out of a particular time and place, and we know in 1948 is when you're talking about that definition, and particularly post-World War II. And there is so much in that definition, particular words, the very specific words like intent, which are very difficult to be able to calculate or ascertain, the in part or in whole, even to the point of stopping people being born, which could go to destruction of hospitals and medical services, which is why when people have tried to assess, and it's interesting you spoke about Gaza, but you didn't mention Sudan.
Yeah, that's true, I didn't.
Because, again, what has happened, and I think, is that the definition itself has been captured by a particular moment in time now where these words become enlisted in culture wars that seek to express virtue on one side or the other and to deny or cancel the virtue of the other. And genocide is not an opinion. And I think in public parlance, in public discourse, I think we've seen a lot of that.
What do you mean, where it's expressed just as an opinion?
As an opinion, or as a way of expressing a particular political allegiance, identity, or a set of virtues that you believe that you represent, or your tribe or people represent. Hence you raised Gaza and you didn't raise Sudan. And hence we don't see people mounting protests and putting tents up about Sudan, because that doesn't fit into the framework of the modern Western political culture war that seeks to identify one way or another with a particular side of some event or argument. And to that extent, I think that the 1948 definition doesn't speak to the politically charged and culturally charged times that we live in. If you look at what the studies into what is taking place, if you want to use the Gaza-Israel situation as the example that you've raised, there have been studies of various types into that. There's also been a charge brought to the International Criminal Justice Court. And if you look at the studies or the judgment of those things, there have been various results based on just that definition, to a condemnation of genocide or genocide in part. 3 out of 5 I saw in one study, or to the dismissal of it, of all. And what is complicated in this case as well is that you have people directly involved in this for whom that definition in 1948 was written to address. So it is a very politically and culturally charged time to try to define and identify something like genocide based purely on that definition.
The other area I didn't mention is what took place on this continent, which has been, I think, after the Bringing Them Home Royal Commission, it was identified as meeting these specific elements, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a people, which was clear through some of the evidence that was presented back. Do you think that that term has application also in Australia? I mean, you've just written an incredibly powerful piece about your decision not to go to Bathurst, to look at what occurred to your own Wiradjuri people in their war against the authorities based in Brisbane at the time. How do you see that part of our history?
Again, it's you're engaging two parts of me there too. To engage, it's like asking someone in the midst of the conflicts in Sudan, or the conflicts in Ukraine, or the conflicts in Gaza, or the conflicts that we see anywhere around the world, to be able to speak to something in both the abstract and the personal. And so the application of the 1948 definition, which is written 150 years after the slaughter of Wiradjuri people around Bathurst, to try to retrofit that becomes a very abstract exercise. And again, just like as we try to measure the definitions of genocide in our world today, you could apply that definition and you could, in an objective sense, come down on an argument or various versions of that arguments to be able to apply that. But then you ask me as a Wiradjuri person who lives with the scars, both real and inherited, of that, and that requires a very different response. And I know what it feels like to come from a people who faced extermination, which is what we faced, extermination. At the time of the war in Bathurst, the Sydney Gazette described it as an exterminating war. So that was what was being sought to be done. And if you go to the proclamation of martial law, it says, in the interests of creating a place of peace, that we would be put outside the protection of the law, that we could and we were killed with impunity, legal impunity. So I have to navigate a personal, historical, political and legal minefield, and those things are very difficult. I think it's also a risk. I think you've highlighted a risk here as well, and that is that when we come to these things, we can sometimes try to assess them through the act of the person committing the violence and not the view from the people who are suffering the violence. We'll get to it later, but I think that was one of the failures of Hannah Arendt and the idea of the banality of evil, but we'll get to that. If you turn it around and you ask the person who is suffering that, then they are going to have a very different response, and that won't be necessarily easily defined in things like a 1948 definition of genocide.
So if I was to summarise where we're up to, and what we might do later on is swap chairs. So that you can look back at the other people. Unfortunately, you're getting my best side back there.
I thought he meant we'll swap chairs and I can ask him some questions, which I will do.
How novel would that be? Have you ever done that before?
I've done that to you a lot of times. This is his revenge.
This is really good fun, actually, being on the other side. So I'm at risk of potentially verbling you here, but I think if I was to summarise where we've got to, that this word, with its formal definition, may not be capturing the truth in a useful way for the following reasons. One, that it can be deployed as a rhetorical weapon, where one side or another feels justified in saying, I will lay before you the ultimate charge, namely that of genocide, with all that's implied in it, this destructive, evil urge to destroy a whole people in whole or part. That's one reason why it may not be a useful thing to deploy, because it can be weaponised in that sense without regard for the specific meaning that might be there. The second reason why it may not be a useful way to start or end a conversation about what lies at the heart of it is that it tends to be, as you just suggested, understood from the perpetrator's perspective. What are their intent? What have they done? Rather than the experience of those who are on the other side, who, whatever the definition might say in legal terms, may be experiencing something which is substantively for them more weighty than words can simply encompass. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think so. I want to pick up on the word that I think is much more germane, and I think precedes the use of the word or the creation of the word genocide, and that is the word evil.
Yeah.
And I think that is a much more penetrating way of trying to understand what we are seeing in our world in all of its various forms of suffering, both suffered and inflicted on the sufferer. And I think to come to grips with the nature of evil may be much more enlightening and useful than to apply what are limited terms of genocide to describe the acts that we're seeing in our world now. And interestingly, we have been able to dragoon the word genocide much more comfortably into the various cultural and political wars that we see within our public discourse now than the word evil.
Yeah.
Evil is not a word that we're comfortable with using, and in many cases even accepting as real.
Now, it's got a couple of different possible dimensions, this word. One is in the philosophical tradition, evil is simply the opposite of good. So it doesn't require some demonic force or some act of will. There can be an entirely natural event, such as a storm coming through, it knocks down a tree, it crushes your car or something, and that would fall under the philosophical heading of evil. But there's a theological account too.
Yeah, we'll go to both those, but interestingly, one of the things that created, that really spurred on the Enlightenment and the rise of rationality, the supplanting of theology with a philosophical view of the word was an act of nature with the Lisbon earthquake. And at the Lisbon earthquake, people suddenly, and enormous numbers of people killed, suddenly the whole question of the possibility of a God in the world that could allow such massive destruction by the forces of nature spurred on the Enlightenment and the rise of reason and rationality as an answer to the omnipotence and omniscience of God.
And we'll come back to that moment, because I want to still stick with a more the kind of this worldly account. People know of your storied journalistic career, that you've spent time in Australia, but also had a very extensive career as a foreign correspondent, for global networks, and that brought you into regions of conflict which were intense. I'm thinking about Afghanistan and Pakistan and things like that. And when we began discussing this issue of what is the bigger thing behind the definition of genocide and the notion of evil, you told me of an encounter you had with, I think, a Taliban who'd been arrested. Is that right? Maybe you can tell us the story.
I think, again, we've been discussing these things in a very... And I think it's useful to be able to apply an abstract philosophical lens to these things, because I think establishment of terms, both legal and philosophical, give us, soft guardrails to be able to have very, very hard conversations without being misunderstood, misrepresented, or dragged into unnecessary culture wars that simply don't take us anywhere. But they have to land somewhere. And I knew there was evil in the world, Simon. I mean, if you're an Aboriginal person, you know that evil is possible. And that as Simone Weil, the great French philosopher and mystic, once described, we know the chill of affliction when you are reduced to just a thing. No longer something human, but a thing. But I came face to face with the manifestation in physical form of the force of evil in the universe when I was in Pakistan, and I was up on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border I was embedded with Pakistani forces who were involved in some of the fiercest fighting against Taliban forces along that border. It's really not a border at all. That northern part of Pakistan is fairly just open territory. It's really Talibanistan. It's Pashtunistan. And a man had been arrested who I was taken in to interview. And he was in chains. His job, and it's hazard to call it a job, but his job was to turn children into suicide bombers. Children who would be kidnapped from their homes, who would be sexually abused, who would be deprived of sleep, who would be brainwashed, who would have every ounce of their humanity drained from their souls and turned into automatons, where they are simply part of the apparatus. I saw both sides of this. I've stood in marketplaces where children, and they are children, have walked in and detonated bombs and killed dozens of people. And this man's job was to do that. He was an engineer of evil. What was so disturbing was how utterly charismatic, beatific, seductive this man was. He was astonishingly beautiful. He had a voice that sounded like golden honey, and he really disturbed me. He was sitting there then and telling me that he regretted what he'd done, and I am sorry, but
Did you believe him?
No, they were just words. What disturbed me was how he made me feel, and to confront the possibility that in those circumstances I would be capable of the sort of evil that he could engineer.
You thought he could seduce you?
Oh, most definitely. This was a metaphysical force of evil. This was not talking to someone as a human being. This was a force of evil in a human form. I really felt that.
Had you ever encountered that before?
Not in that explicit human form. I'd seen evil acts, but I think there is a difference between the act of evil and the sheer force of evil in the world, the manifestation of the devil, if we want to use that word. I do want to use that word. My cameraman, he and I had done we'd had a lot of hard miles. We had seen hard things. We'd worked in Iraq together. We worked in Afghanistan together. We'd done years of this work. He was an Iraqi man whose father was killed by Saddam Hussein. He was on a wanted list himself because he was working with CNN, an American network. This was a tough man. And we got back in the helicopter to leave afterwards, after having interviewed this man. And Samad, my cameraman, turned to me and he said, "Did you find that person beautiful?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Did that scare you?" And I said, "Yes." And that's all we said to each other. There was a malevolent force there that I would say is the absence of both the human and the absence of God. And I think that is the essence of evil.
What happened to that man?
He was executed. But that was merely the execution of the physical form of the man who did the acts. It wasn't the elimination of the manifestation of evil that lived in that human form.
So we'll come to the two dimensions of that, the absence of the human and the absence of perhaps the divine or whatever, or the presence of something that you think was a real metaphysical element. But before I do that, let's start with the human part. I think one of the things about what enables the very worst actions against other humans, their slaughter, their deprival of liberty, all sorts of things, was what you talked about experiencing, and that what Aboriginal people experienced about not being recognised as fully human or human at all.
As a thing.
And as a thing, yeah. And I think if you look at the build-up to genocide in any of the historical examples that might be drawn upon, it always begins with this notion to say of another person, they are not fully human, or they are so lacking in personhood that they become this thing.
Which was said about us as Aboriginal people, explicitly.
How on earth do you think it becomes possible for such a falsehood to take root in the way that it obviously does? Because there are so many examples through history where, they can. I think about that thing from Shakespeare, Shylock, where he's saying, if you do we not bleed? If you prick us, do we not bleed? Obviously we are like you, and yet I've heard these stories over and over. I remember during the war in Vietnam, there was this infamous moment when there was, I think, some children, I think it may have been around the napalming and other things, and somebody phoning into a Melbourne radio station, I think it was, said, "Oh, but they can always have more." As if the mother wasn't capable of feeling the great depth of...
Children taken off us because they believed they were better to be raised by someone else. Look,
so how do we do that? Because there's got to be something in...
I think there is. And let me just... there are multiple sides to me that I've sort of tried to bring to this, both as a person who lives in the shadow of a history of those acts, as someone who has philosophically tried to understand those things, who has gone out into the world and sat in the face of evil itself, and as someone who has a Doctorate of Theology. And it was theology, I think, more than anything else, that got me closest to some sort of understanding of what we're talking about when we try to wrestle with the nature of evil. I think philosophers want to see evil as something that exists within the realm of the human. Luke Russell does some wonderful work. He's in Sydney, at Sydney University, I think. He's a wonderful writer on things of evil. He sees that as the immoral extreme, you know, the collapse of morality. It doesn't even have to be an act. It can be an omission of something, the failure to act, or a thwarted act that is still in essence evil. Theology takes you somewhere else. It takes you to a more metaphysical and even supernatural understanding of what the forces of evil are.
So do you think these are connected? So my starting point was there is clear evidence through history that human beings can be convinced or can be, it speaks to the prejudice that's already there, whatever it is, to deny an evident reality that those who, because of their gender, their colour, their religion, whatever, are as much a person as they are. Now, do you think that that is possible? Are you saying that theology has an explanation for that, or do you think it's something?
I think theology has an explanation for that, and that is that I don't believe that God, as I understand God, and as a Wiradjuri person, God is not something that I question, right? I mean, Bayami, the creator, the act of existence. You know, Thomas Aquinas talks about God as being ipsum esse, the act of existence. We know that our universe, 13.88 billion years ago, comes into creation ex nihilo, from nothing to something. And the possibility of us sitting here today and the possibility of us loving our children is created in that moment of what is a creative spark of love. Not a creative spark of destruction, but a creative spark of love. Theologically, I don't believe that God is capable of an act of evil. I think that is antithetical to the very idea of God. And I think as human beings, as the image of God, are not capable of the act of evil either. But I think in the absence of God, I think evil flourishes.
You have to unpack this, because you've just described a man who you said was engaged in the most abhorrent conduct, the sexual abuse, of kidnapping, abusing, conditioning, reducing them to things so that they can kill others that they consider to be no better than things. That is a human being that is doing this.
It is a human being.
That's why they're in chains. That's why they're going to be executed.
They killed the human being, but they did not kill the manifestation of evil that it was embodied within the human being. The human being, in the absence of the divine, the absence of the omnipotent, omniscient love of the creation of the universe, the act of existence itself, ipsum esse, the idea of God, which is not a, as Richard Dawkins had lampooned as a sort of flying spaghetti monster, but as something far more refined than he was capable of expressing. That absence of that is the possibility of evil, but it is not the essence of being human, which is to be one with the act of the divine, omnipotent, omniscient creation of love. But the absence of it is where evil thrives. And that's what I saw in that person. It was not a person capable of... It was a human being as a manifestation of that force of evil. But the force of evil was the very absence of the good itself. Plotinus talks about this as well, right? So the Neoplatonists get very close to this. Plotinus talks about evil as being the absence
of good.
The absence of good. When Simone Weil, who was a Neoplatonist as well as being a mystical Christian figure and originally born Jewish, but she also talks about the thing being the chill of indifference, the very absence of some good itself. St. Augustine talked about that. Thomas Aquinas talks about that. Friedrich Nietzsche, interestingly, takes us to another iteration, and I think that's where we are in modernity today, which is why we see in the past 200 years the wanton slaughter of people in a mean manner unknown to humanity previously, the capacity to destroy life on the planet itself. And that is no longer just the absence of the divine, the absence of God, but the very absence of the absence. Okay. There is not even asking if it exists at all.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that too in a moment, but just relating it back to the topic around genocide. You've said then, I mean, some people would say that the urge to reduce a person to a thing, which has given rise to these genocidal moments in history, is older than we probably know. It's where you don't recognise in the other something of oneself. But many people would argue that the kind of extension of that impulse to having mass destruction is a function of technology being applied as well. So if you want to look at what's distinctive about the 20th century, it's not just that the urge was new, but that it was suddenly coupled with the technological means to do it at massive scale.
And the urge to create the technology designed just to do that. So when I was reporting in war zones, I would see people killed who had never seen their killers because they were killed by drone attacks authorised and executed from Washington, having never ever looked into the eyes of the people that were killed. Barack Obama carried out more of those attacks than any other president.
And that is, I think, a distinctive element of
modern
warfare.
It is evil. It is the
to kill without seeing the
victim? To reduce the person to a thing. To not only is it the absence of God or divine within yourself which creates the capacity for you to do that, but it is the inability to see the creative spark of the divine in the person you're killing, and you no longer have to look them even in the eye.
So, do you think that genocide is a stronger function now of modernity? You've just described a modernity.
I think the capacity to carry it out, yeah.
You're saying modernity is in part a rejection of an older, we'll call it supernatural world in which mystery and where, I suppose, we've got to be careful of talking about modernity, not just the European version of it, because there are all these cultures around the world which are not part of that story.
And are still my culture, for instance, still practicing a very real idea of what it is to belong to something that is mystical and transcendent. I'm also, a Catholic, and I find in that a representation of something mystical and transcendent. The fastest growing demographic of Catholics in Australia are Aboriginal people, precisely, I think, because of that. But to go to your point about genocide...
Oh, just on that, do you think an Indigenous worldview is impossible to conceive of genocide as ever occurring?
Impossible to conceive of it
ever committing? Or
I think, well, we were here for 60, 70, 80,000 years. You don't measure that in time anymore after that. And do we have 60 or 70,000 years left of humanity on this planet? So no, we weren't capable of the manifestation of that. And the embodiment, I have this, when I go back to country, when I'm sitting on my own country, the experience of being a Wiradjuri person is to stand in a complete alignment with the transcendence of the divine, the presence of ancestors, and the grounded nature of being part of that earth without a slither of light between it. And I don't think it is capable of creating the sort of wanton acts of violence to destroy and eliminate people if that is how you are living. But I think in the absence of that, and when you add the technological capacity to inflict that on a mass scale, then yes, that's why we see in the 20th century particularly, and into the 21st century, a rapid explosion of the capacity to commit just that type of wanton mass slaughter that the Genocide Convention struggles and still fails to adequately define.
Let's swap chairs.
Now, sorry to you, and hello to you.
Sorry about that. Hello. This means you can ask me a few questions too if you want. So I'd say that doesn't bode too well for the future in terms of...
No, it doesn't. And I think we see this all around our world now. I think what we're seeing more broadly is a struggle for the secular modern compact, the Cartesian compact with the world, the elevation of rationality and reason above all, the idea of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, which is if you explore the dimensions today, is a very dangerous idea. I think we're seeing the limits of that. I think we're seeing the limits of what a Kantian ethical world can regulate. I think we're seeing this everywhere, both in the retreat of democracy around the world. If you look at the United States as an exemplar of an Enlightenment nation that embodied all of those ideals and believed that you could create, in essence, a new human being that was not bound by kith or kin, but was actually an act of creation itself. I think we're seeing the limits of that And I think the capacity for that to end in environmental destruction or in previously unseen, not unimaginable, but previously unseen industrial slaughter, I think is very real, Simon. I think
I can see, and I've actually made the arguments in other places about the devastating potential of the form of rationality, calculative rationality as it's known, that emerges from Descartes and infests the world, and it's all about control and reducing everything to objects to be manipulated, including people. I can see all that.
Yeah.
And I can see how your narrative... I also have to put it to you, though, that some of the most devastating destruction that has been let loose on the world has been driven by religion, where people have said, you are a heretic. You don't believe in my absolute, exclusive truth claims about the nature of God.
And religions can also embody the absence of God.
Okay, so because you've given a theological account, you've quoted Aquinas and others who are very much grounded within religions where that was their truth. The 30 Years' War, the slaughter that was brought about by religions either within a single faith group, taking account of the Donatists versus this and there, when we all know the stories, the massacres, the torture. Surely that's a form which is just as capable of reducing a person to a thing.
Most definitely, but also within that God impulse, the idea of the divine, there is also the possibility for the human renewal. And you talk about the 30 Years' War, which was a slaughter unprecedented up until that point, and still to this day even greater per capita than what we saw in World War II.
Yeah.
But what emerges in the years after that? The glorious, beautiful choral music of Johann Sebastian Bach.
Yeah, but if you're on the receiving end
yes.
saying, oh well, Bach came along, fantastic.
Oh no, I wouldn't scoff at that, Simon. I don't think that's funny. I think the capacity for love in the face of unmitigated slaughter is all we've got. I wouldn't laugh at that at all. I don't think that's a bad trade-off at all. I mean, I'm not saying that you say, oh, those deaths were worth it.
It's not like a bad.
No, it's not. But I'm saying the capacity for love to endure in the worst and the seed of love to emerge in the worst is the thing that holds us here as human beings. There's a beautiful scene in the Terrence Malick film, The Thin Blue Line, Thin Red Line? Thin Blue, anyway.
I don't know.
It's on Iwo Jima, right? And it's about the war there, and they're pulling away from this place that they have utterly destroyed.
Oh, I think I do know this.
And they look back, and there's a flower pushing up through the rocks. I don't think we should laugh at the flower through the rock, which may be all we've got left to hold on to a hope of humanity in the face of unmitigated slaughter. Tertullian, the 2nd century Christian theologian, talked about the idea of hope. And he said, hope is patience with the lamp lit. If we turn that lamp out, we're done. The capacity for unmitigated slaughter in the name of religion, in the name of politics, often the convergence of religion and politics, and that was also the 30 Years' War, is around, and it is more prevalent, and it is more industrially charged than ever before today. And that's why we must look for the beauty of music. We must look for the flower in the rock. We must look for the spark of the divine. Here's a story I've got to you, just as an antidote to the story of the evil man. I was in Pakistan again after the earthquake, and 200,000 people had been killed and entire homes had disappeared. And I was driving back one day and I saw on dusk a little light in a tent in the middle of a field, and I instinctively felt drawn to it. And so I went over there with my cameraman, and there was a mother. She was cooking food over an open fire. There was inside the tent a father and his 2 sons, one of whom had a broken leg and broken ribs. They told me that they'd lost their home. Their son had died and was crushed under the rubble. They couldn't even find him. They had nothing. The father carried the son with the wounded son, the injured son, 40 kilometres down the side of a mountain with his family to find a relief station. All they had in the world was those meagre rations and a tent. And the mother finished cooking the food, and before they would eat, she turned and offered the first bite to me. In the face of losing everything, the spark of the human. I think sometimes that might be all we've got. Cormac McCarthy's phenomenal novel, The Road, which comes down to the act of love between a father and his son when all else is lost. When all else is lost, there may still be that hope, Simon. I wouldn't laugh at that.
I listened years ago to a group of people who had survived the horrors of the Nazi death camps, and they were talking about how did they have a belief in God and all the rest. And what they described were so-called redemptive acts, of which this is one. It's those moments when humans do something utterly altruistic. There's no sense of any benefit redounding them. I have on my screensaver on all of my computers an image of Janusz Korczak, who was he was a Polish Jewish. He was a doctor who ran orphanages, but he was also very revered by the Germans because he was a children's author. He wrote storybooks and things. And at the time, they were clearing out the Warsaw Ghetto, and the orphans, this many, I think hundreds of children, were being sent to their inevitable death. And the Nazi officer, the German officer, stopped Korczak and said, "Doctor, you don't have to go. We know who you are, all the joy you've given." And I imagine at that time in the Second World War, he had no sense that history would ever remember him because the Germans were dominant. He would fade away without any sense of even satisfaction, but he chose selflessly to go with the children and to accompany them to their death so that there was some adult they knew who cared for them, which was there all the way through to the end. And that's the kind of example which I think they spoke of on the radio, where there's that case. And I imagine the woman in the tent who looks at you and says, "You have the first bite." That's a selfless gesture to you as a person.
Yeah.
Now, I wonder, okay, and the whole point about this is they're rare. But the reason they're called redemptive acts, so I just finished the story, is not because all of us can aspire to do that throughout our lives, but that we know that because one person did it, we participate in that form of being, human being that is capable. That's part of what we can be. Now, do you think those things, I'm coming back to the world, well, let's stick with Sudan, which you know far more about what's actually happening there than I. Do you think that has any purchase in these moments of genocidal intent where others have been reduced to things to be wiped away? What's the power of this idea, if any? Or is it something which we just...
of what idea?
The good that I just described. Or is it just something which gives us some measure of comfort that...
No, okay, I don't think it gives us some measure of comfort. I think it is the ultimate salvation of us all. You know, the absence of the good that Plotinus talks about, the act of affliction that Simone Weil talks about. The man that I saw who reduced those human beings, those boys, to a thing, they committed acts of evil, but the evil was in the man who programmed them to do those things. And I think the reaching for the good, that struggle for the light in the darkness, is the essence of being human. You know, I think when I've found that everywhere. The one abiding question of my life, Simon, that comes from my upbringing, my history, is really this. In an abstract sense, it is how do you find dignity in a world of catastrophe, which is what that woman represented, which is what the story you were talking about represented. But even more than that, it is this. When you've had your guts kicked out, how do you love? And I look at my parents who, frankly, and in my father's case, did have his guts kicked out. And the reaching for love in those broken lives is the thing that has sustained me.
It's your mum's love for your dad, isn't it? I think you said
my mum's love for my
him.
dad, which had rescued him, but also the capacity of my father to respond to love in a world where he had known so much hurt and hate. because of the colour of his skin. And to look at them now and to see the grace that they embody is the thing that I've searched for all around the world. And to look for that grace in the face of evil, to be returned to the oneness of goodness, and to not endure the absence of God or the absence of God or the divine or whatever you want to call it, that allows evil to flourish. I have searched for that everywhere, and I think it is so easy to be seduced into the sort of moral relativism of our age, to assign evil to one side or another, and to not know, as I had to confront when I sat in front of that man, of the potential for the seductive nature of evil within myself. To be able to recognise that these things, to fall from grace and reduce another person to a thing, sits within us all. Even people who love their children are capable of killing the children of others. And I think to be reminded of that brings me back to an honesty in that search for the grace and dignity in the face of catastrophe that I would hope underpins the best of what I try to do in the world.
So how do you bring this thinking about it to bear in the practical realities of the world in which we live today? I mean, we sit here where these things are unfolding in real time with devastating effects. And we've agreed that naming it one thing or another may not be the best way to deal with it, because that can be used for rhetorical purposes, that there's something deeper. We've been exploring what that something is. If we wish it to be prevented, the evil which is expressed in its apotheosis of genocide, that you're no longer a person, you're a thing, what do we do? Because I'm just trying to think, how do I go to Sudan?
Simon, I think we love, and I'm not saying that as some limp idea, some sort of esoteric idea of love. I'm talking about the transcendent capacity for creative love in our world that allows someone to be able to find the way to go on. I've been to those places, and I look at so much commentary around what we're seeing in Gaza or what we're seeing in other parts of the world, and it is so self-indulgent, and it is so distant, and it is so abstract. I've been to those places. I've spent 40 years in the worst places in the world trying to find out why the worst things happened here. I know that in the midst of war, it is not loud. It's not loud like the conversations we have. It's not loud like the culture wars that we wage on social media. It is devastatingly quiet. Devastatingly. Death is so quiet. And I've seen people light a candle at night in places of death. I've seen people express love in places of death. And that is the most real thing to me. That is what, when I see my father's hand in my mother's hand, and I think of the fight and the struggle they've had to get here and to give me some shot at life, that love overcomes the history of hatred that could annihilate us. We may not be able to stop the annihilation, Simon, and history tells us we can't. But in that, there is still something redemptive in the power of... Dostoevsky knew this, right? You must read the truth from the people who tell the truth, not politicians, not the commentators, not the social media activists. Dostoevsky in Brothers Karamazov, where he's talking to the woman who has no love, the woman of little faith. And she has great love for the world, but no love for a human. And he talks about the need for active love, the active love that seeks to restore the essence of the oneness with the creative love of the universe. That is all that will save us. And I think staying with a clarity of righteousness, it is so easy to fall prey to the images of our world and the media-created images. And I was watching the Democratic National Convention just yesterday. And I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday afternoon. He was so inspired by it. And I said, you must have been looking at something very different to me. because what I saw there was not the act of righteousness. What I saw there was the performance of righteousness. America's burning. During the Obama era, when he was saying, yes, we can, the numbers of deaths of despair in America, they are people who are blowing their brains out with opioids, alcohol or guns. Not from medical deaths, not from disease or illness. Deaths of utter hopelessness and unhappiness. Between the ages of 40 and 55, the middle age, they tripled. They tripled. Did anybody say that in the Democratic National Convention? Did anyone stand up and walk out there and say, we have failed you? We bailed out the banks and you lost your homes. We have sent your kids to fight our forever wars and come back and their factories have closed down because we've sent the jobs somewhere else and we don't give a damn, frankly. We have wiped our feet all over you and we called you deplorables and we debased the White House and we cozied up to power and we've created a society where 1% of Americans hold the combined wealth of the bottom 50% combined. And they stand there and say, hope's making a comeback? For who? Now I look at that and I think, I was that person. I was homeless for the first 13 or 14 years of my life. My father lost 3 tips of 3 fingers trying to put food on our table, working in sawmills. My mother knocked on charities and churches, looking for food relief. I would pack up and move in the middle of the night. I changed schools 14 times before I was into high school. I watched my father wonder how the hell he can go on with almost every bone in his body broken and a 50-cent size stab wound in his shoulder and tattoos carved into his arms and up his chest. And love got me there. And I look at these people and I thought, you would have left me to rot, just as you're leaving tens of millions of Americans to rot. Don't give me your platitudes of hope. Do something. And I think we need to be very clear about where evil, they are treating so many Americans like a thing. Donald Trump and his lies and his dancing naked in front of the flames of America doesn't have an answer for them, and the Democrats want to give them platitudes, and people are dying because they're being treated like a thing, and the rich are getting richer, and if you cut your arm on a barbed wire fence and you're poor, you die of sepsis because you can't get a tetanus shot. Now I'm sorry. We have to look at that and say, that is a manifestation of evil, that is a failure of the righteousness and the goodness and the oneness of goodness in our world.
So as we move to conclude towards, we've got a few minutes left, and I know you want to ask me something at some point. There's a couple of things coming to mind. One is...
I've got one big question for Simon.
Oh, good. Oh, great. You know, when somebody says, I've got one question, he'll probably say, oh, it's easy. Firstly, and I'm working backwards now, it's about the importance of speaking the truth into these things. The second thing, though, which is only dawning to me as you were talking about, I asked about Sudan and others, and perhaps the kind of solution you describe is only available to the people who are there, that we can't, for all of our protesting and other things, actually change it. That if your formula for dealing with the problem of genocide is that people rediscover that human connection, that moment.
It might be all we've got because we're in cahoots with it, Simon. I mean, governments are in cahoots with this industrial military complex that we know inflicts war and profits from war around the world. We're in cahoots with it.
That's the truth component.
That's the truth of it.
And that part we could change, not become complicit.
Of course we could. Of course we could. But do our democracies allow for that now? I mean, if you want to get elected in America, you better have deep pockets. And where did the money come from? And what are they going to want from you when they get you elected? They're not going to have you raid their banks and give it to the poor. I mean, you know, we're seeing the seeds of the same thing in Australia. And we know people have had enough because they're telling us they've had enough. The vote for the 2 primary parties, the major parties in Australia, their primary vote is at an all-time low. You get a government now that 2/3 of you did not vote for. We don't want it, and people are looking elsewhere, and the media keeps lying to us because the media is in cahoots with this same chaos, this same management of savagery that we see throughout liberal democracies, and their only answer is what we see in the Democratic Convention, platitudes of hope and unity. You can't unify over a country where 1% of the population holds the combined wealth of the bottom 50%. That is obscene. And so I think the clarity of that, and to speak to that, and I look to the artists and the writers and the people not beholden to that power to be able to speak to those things. You know, there's a wonderful line in a Bruce Springsteen song, The River, which says, is a dream a lie if it don't come true? Or is it something worse? If you're at the bottom of the pile in America and you've been fed the American dream as a lie, is it something even worse?
Do you think that then, if there's a larger truth to be spoken and responded to, that it's at all possible that people who currently take the issues which are dividing and become rooted in one camp over another, whatever the conflict, whatever the ideological position, whatever the religious orientation, and social media has deepened those divisions, there's no doubt about that. Do you see it coming together at point? Do you think the ideas you're expressing are capable of bridging things so that people don't belt each other on either side and find something positive?
Paradoxically, it comes together in the places that we don't see. In the chaos that the media reports on, which is real, and the divisions of America are very real. The the historical and racial and gender and class divisions are absolutely real. But within that, we find the capacity for people to be able to come together in those things, to share space uncomfortably with each other, to fight for the same air. And that doesn't mean you have to vote in the same way or believe in the same thing or worship in the same church or synagogue or mosque or temple or not at all. But the capacity to still find the human in the other, what Emmanuel Levinas talked about is suffering for the sufferer. I still see that. I still see that. But I don't think that's the world that we live in the headlines. I don't think that's the lie that politicians of all persuasions want to give us. I don't think that's the story that the media gives us, but it's in the little lives, it's in the living that we do these things.
It's before us all the time, but never discussed, is it?
Before us all the time, but never discussed. And when it is discussed, we are forced into or corralled into artificial divisions and inflamed by media and politics that seeks to profit from that. When the reality is that, look around this room and you're all different and you've all come from somewhere and you're all sharing this space and you're listening to this and you're agreeing or you're disagreeing and we're doing this beautiful thing. And I see the beautiful thing and the capacity for the beautiful thing even in the worst places. Otherwise I would have given up on it a long time ago. And I think that exists, but I don't think that's the story that we're told, because the people who profit from the worst of it don't want us to know that. They don't want us to believe that reality. And they are still milking the conflict and hatred that they generate through policies that enhance and deepen this impoverishment of vast numbers of people, and then pit us against each other in these false binaries.
What's your question for me?
Is Australia an evil country? In the terms that we've spoken about today, and the broader terms of the manifestation of the absence of good and the capacity for violence and evil inflicted on the most vulnerable people, is Australia evil?
I'm going to say no, because of those very things you just described. I think we live in a system which is capable of either perpetrating, excusing, or enabling the kind of evil you've described. But I also see in the stories that are not told, in those day-to-day exchanges, the kind of friendships that people like you and I have from very different backgrounds, but the crossovers and the moments we shared, that, to my mind, is indicative of the redemptive capacity. I don't think it's just about... In fact, I do think it's something special about Australia. I think, and I alluded to that at the beginning, it's that 65x whatever thousands of years of a way of being, which is not about being on something but being of it. That even if it's rejected, it's nonetheless affecting the whole of the... I don't think you can live in this continent not be touched by that. And I think to that extent, our luckiness as a nation is not in our minerals and our resources. It's in the fact that we've come to a place where, let's take it, genocide itself is impossible because of that mode of being to which we're all invited. So that's how I think.
And yet Australia last year was asked to enshrine that mode of being in the Constitution and said no. How does that sit with that vision?
And for me, that was a moment of intense sadness, because as you know from my own personal history, having been adopted into the Nguluway kinship structure, I am the living proof, despite the colour of my skin and my genetics, that any Australian who wishes to be part of that story has to say yes and then go back and listen and learn. So it was deeply sad for me, but it's not something that defeated me, because I think what we failed to do, and it's not a failure, it's not about blame, it's just what didn't happen, was that the nature of the invitation to every Australian was never as clear as it could have been. There weren't enough people like me, I think, even saying it's possible. So on balance, I don't think it's evil. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an incredibly difficult thing to have a conversation of this depth about something as profound as the deepest evil of which we are capable. I've not encountered the kind of person, at least I've never felt I've encountered a person like that man you had there, nor been in all of the war zones, and I'll never forget now what you said about the silence of it, the silence of death. But I think we've been all remarkably lucky to have Stan Grant with his deep experience of humanity and an incredibly brave and lonely position to take to talk about these things in that way. So would you please join with me in thanking Stan?
Thank you.
This session was recorded live at Carriage Works Sydney in August 2024. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a not-for-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit ethics.org.au to find out more. Thank you.